When a murder happens, unless one or more participants give a full and honest confession, or unless there is clear video or reliable eyewitness testimony to detail what happened, the real truth of what happened is difficult to recreate. Investigators and prosecutors trying to seek justice for the victim and the victim's family do not have to prove exactly what happened. So often, even if there is a killer convicted for the murder, questions remain about what exactly happened. Legally speaking, the person convicted is considered a murderer, but the reality may often be murkier. Let's examine the murder of FSU law professor Dan Markel and the mysteries that remain in the case. July 18, 2014. It is about 10:45 a.m. Two Miami hitmen are following Dan Markel, a Florida State University College of Law professor, from the gym to his home. The hitmen are driving a Toyota Prius and therefore are able to silently pull in behind Dan Markel's vehicle as he is parking it in the garage of his home. One of the hitmen gets out of the car and walks up to Markel's driver's side. Markel sees a stranger approaching and tells this to the teacher with whom he is talking on the phone. As he is learning more about the school, his ex-wife Wendy wants their eldest son to attend. The hitman reaches the front driver's side of the vehicle and aims. Markel lifts his left arm in a defensive move, but it is too late. The hitman shoots him twice in the head. Markel's beautiful mind is destroyed, and he dies from his injuries a few hours later, in the early morning hours of July 19, 2014. So who organized this hit? By 2012, Dan Markel and Wendy Adelson had been married for about 7 years, and they had 2 kids, 2 boys. Wendy, however, had enough of married life, so she filed for divorce. Wendy wanted to move with their 2 kids to South Florida. She not only had enough of the marriage to Dan Markel, she also had enough of small-town and totally boring Tallahassee. Wendy's family wanted that too, very badly, especially Wendy's mom, Donna Adelson. But Dan Markel put his foot down and insisted that the children, and therefore Wendy, should remain in Tallahassee so he could continue having a close relationship with them. The divorce got ugly. The popular couple's friends were forced to choose between Team Wendy and Team Danny. Depositions were taken, including the deposition of Wendy. Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie became very involved in this war, and her parents were not shy about making crazy proposal after crazy proposal to deal with the Dan Markel problem. Charlie would even joke about hiring a hitman as a divorce present. The divorce reached a somewhat amicable conclusion in the summer of 2013, and Dan won the main battle of the divorce. He was able to keep the kids in Tallahassee. The 2 sides, however, quickly began fighting in court again, over money and over failure to comply with other terms of the divorce settlement agreement. Of particular concern to Dan was parental alienation efforts by Donna Adelson to say bad things to his boys about him, even referring to him as stupid when talking to the boys. By May of 2014, about 2 months before the murder, Dan, through his lawyer, was going to take Wendy's deposition again. This time, the questions would be about her alleged financial fraud, about Dan's allegation that she failed to disclose assets during the divorce litigation, an account that she claimed in the post-divorce litigation was a non-marital asset. Dan was arguing that he should not pay an additional equitable distribution amount that was due under their agreement because the settlement agreement was tainted by Wendy's failure to disclose that account. He sought sanctions against Wendy and Wendy's lawyer, Kristen Adamson. But then, suddenly, it was canceled, and it never happened. Why? Well, the hit happened. Do you remember Charlie Adelson's joke about hiring a hitman? Well, Florida prosecutors claim that this joke became true, that Charlie hired the Miami hitman who murdered his former brother-in-law, and that he did so with the help of Charlie's girlfriend, Katherine Magbanua. The investigation revealed that the murder of Dan Markel involved a complex web involving multiple individuals with varying degrees of involvement. When he was making those jokes about hiring a hitman, Charlie was having a fling with single mother Katherine Magbanua. Katherine had a prior long-term relationship with a tough guy, Sigfredo Garcia, with whom she had 2 children. The state argued that several members of the Adelson family were involved in having Charlie hire Magbanua, to in turn hire Sigfredo Garcia to kill Dan Markel. At first, the state's theory made perfect sense. Charlie would hire his girlfriend Katie as a middlewoman, and Katie would hire her ex, Sigfredo, with whom she had 2 children, as the hitman. That way, If the hitman gets caught, he would not turn in the mother of his children, Katie. And since only Katie would know who hired them, the people hiring the hitman would be protected. The less each side knew about the other participants, the better. We are now almost 10 years removed from the murder. There have been 4 convictions, those of Luis Rivera, Sigfredo Garcia, Katherine Magbanua, and Charles Adelson, and now there are pending charges against one more person, Donna Adelson, the victim's ex-mother-in-law. And while some of the evidence matches the theory put forward by the state, after the extensive investigation that culminated with the 2016 arrests of Luis Rivera, Sigfredo Garcia, and not long thereafter, Katherine Magbanua, there are a lot of puzzling things that happened since, and many mysteries remain in the case. So let's talk about what we know and what mysteries remain. The hit. There is little to no doubt that Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia were involved in the murder of Dan Markel. However, questions still remain about who actually killed Dan Markel. The state's witness suggesting that Sigfredo Garcia was the shooter at the first trial in 2019 was quite weak. The juror I interviewed was not convinced that Sigfredo was the shooter. Could it have been Luis Rivera or someone else? Luis Rivera is of course the more likely alternate suspect. He was a gang leader. He was more under control. He secured the murder weapon on the street. We heard a lot about Sigfredo being high on drugs during the trip, but not much, if any, about Luis being high. Who was so bad that he shot a gun in the Prius, hitting the gas line? Well, according to Luis, it was Sigfredo. And then what? Would Luis trust Sigfredo to walk up to Dan Markel and do a good job on the hit? Keep in mind that the hit went off perfectly. For the bad guys, with Dan Markel being shot twice in the head, 2 nearly perfect shots. Additionally, Luis is the person who rented the Prius, according to the records submitted by the state. Then there was the traffic ticket that suggests that Luis was alone in the vehicle, possibly. And Luis took investigators for a ride all over the state and could not find the lake where supposedly Sigfredo Garcia threw away the gun. Would finding the gun point to someone else, possibly even Luis? There are indicators that Sigfredo was the shooter, don't get me wrong. Although we can barely see inside the Prius in the bus footage as the Prius is leaving Tallahassee after the murder, or in any other security footage. It does appear that someone is excited on the passenger side of the Prius, and that the person is wearing something with a long white sleeve. But even if that was Sigfredo, does that prove he was the shooter? And then hours later, in South Florida, at an ATM, you see Luis driving, and Sigfredo on the passenger side, wearing something with a long white sleeve. There are other jail informants or shady witnesses who have offered evidence against Sigfredo, but the state did not find it meritorious enough to use any of it at trial. Let's say the reality was a bit different. Let's say that Katie was not as involved as Luis suggests. Let's give her credit. She is simply the conduit of a letter from an Adelson to a potential hitman. The letter says what needs to be done and assures excellent compensation through Katie. Then Katie gives the letter to Sigfredo and tells him to hire someone else to do the hit. Maybe Katie thought of herself and Sigfredo as the middlemen, or more like uninvolved conduits for that letter, and someone else altogether would be the hitman. Katie would not want the father of her children directly involved in the murder. So Sigfredo goes to whom? His best friend, of course, the man who is the leader of the Miami chapter of a gang. And maybe Luis agrees to do the hit, but requires Sigfredo to come along. Maybe Sigfredo was even the fall guy, in case anything went wrong. Maybe Luis preferred for Sigfredo to be high during the trips. Maybe that was part of his plan. And then there is the issue of how much was paid for the hit. Luis said $100,000 split among the 3 of them, Luis, Sigfredo, and Katie. Charles Adelson, in his extortion theory, indicated that the demand was for $1/3 and that he made an initial payment of $138,000. And then he began making monthly payments to Katie that were not supposed to be for Katie, but were rather for the hitmen/extorters. However, there were communications between Charles and Katie about her being added to the payroll before the alleged extortion even happened. So what about this alternative scenario? The hit was $100,000, and Charles lied about the $138,000 to try to get the convicted co-conspirators to think each screwed the other. Charles paid the $100,000 thinking that was the payment for the hit. As for Katie, she was separately being compensated just for being the conduit of the letter, through favors, such as adding her to the payroll, buying her gifts, etc. Rashbaum asked a good question. Why would the Adelsons put a co-conspirator on the payroll of the Adelson Institute and create a paper trail for their sinister relationship? Perhaps the answer is this: because Katie's role was not as big as the state thought initially. Perhaps because Katie is telling the truth when she claims that she knows so little. Perhaps because in the mind of Charles, and whichever other Adelson was involved, Katie's role was never going to be one where she knew anything, where she was a direct conduit of communications about the hit, the movements of Dan Markel, etc. There is support for this. If the hitmen were being fed information about Dan Markel, why would they have to follow him all over town during the trips to Tallahassee? So what about all of the calls between the co-conspirators? What about those cell tower records suggesting that Katie was much more actively involved? Look, I am not saying that Katie was not as involved as we thought of initially, and I am not saying that Sigfredo was not the shooter. However, it is always important to keep an open mind and to reevaluate a case as more information comes in. So far, Sigfredo Garcia has not acknowledged participation in the murder. He is still trying to fight for a new trial and/or a new appeal. He was unwilling to testify at Katie's trial, and it seemed that Katie's lawyers wanted him to confess to the murder and to reveal a direct connection between him and Charles Adelson. Sigfredo's former lawyer, Sam Zangani, gave an interview where he suggested that Sigfredo wanted to protect Katie at the expense of his own defense, and said that if Sigfredo testified, it would not have helped Katie. So why did Sigfredo refuse to testify for Katie and against Charles? Is it because he still hopes to get a new trial and to be found not guilty? Is it because he did not want to lie in court? We just don't know, but certainly, a lesser role than we all thought may have fueled the decisions of Magbanua and Garcia not to cooperate. Maybe in their minds they were not involved at all, or were barely involved. Maybe they just knew that the state had so many details wrong in its theory that this knowledge boosted their overconfidence about winning at trial. There has to be a logical explanation as to why these two people, both of whom had the opportunity to negotiate great deals with the state as it sought to charge the people involved in hiring them, decided to stay silent, with only Katie now finally speaking out, when it is clearly too late to give her hope that she will spend a significant time of her future life in freedom. Let's look at something else involving Katherine Magbanua and Charles Adelson. The agitated state of Charles Adelson in the evening of July 18, 2014, hours after the shooting. Both Charles and Katherine were consistent in their testimony about this. Katie, in her proffer, before Charles even testified, indicated that Charles Adelson was acting bizarrely, that he was freaking out, on the evening of the 18th. Charles spun that to suggest that he was freaking out because he was just extorted. Because Katherine just told him that some bad people had killed Dan Markel, although he was still alive, of course, and that they would do the same to him or one of his family members unless he paid them, via Katie, $250,000. So Charles is walking around gun in hand and later takes a Xanax to self-medicate, to relax. Charles and Katherine seem to be consistent about this. Another bizarre fact that comes out in the proffer is that Katherine tells investigators that Charles told her that evening that his former brother-in-law had been in an accident. Now let's look at these events from different perspectives. What are the possible scenarios that are consistent with this testimony? First, of course, Charles could have pre-planned an extortion defense from the start. He might have had an older security camera system in place and may have been acting out as if he was being extorted without totally tipping Katherine on what he was doing. And maybe later, he watches the recording, thinks it is a fail, and gets rid of the recording and of the system, putting in a new one. Possible? Yes. Likely? No. The extortion story smells more like something that was made up after the fact. If that was the plan all along, they would have had receipts. What are more real scenarios that justify Charles's behavior? First, he may have been reacting to the news that Dan Markel was finally shot, that it was done, but not really. He may have been reacting to the news that Dan Markel was still alive, or he may have been overthinking scenarios and realizing what he had done, that he had brought some bad people into their lives, and that they may come after him as well, that those people had something on him, and that he may be extorted moving forward. Maybe he took too much Xanax, or took a combination of drugs and alcohol that fueled some paranoid thoughts. Maybe he was worried that Dan was still alive, and that they would all be found out. I think all of these are very possible scenarios, What about the statement to Katie that Dan Markel had been involved in an accident? That is consistent with the manner he and Katie talk after the bump. With Charlie and Katie not having a pre-established code, but not speaking directly what they mean, but saying things assuming the other person will understand what they really mean. The so-called code talk. Or this may also be consistent with the idea that Katie was not as involved at all as prosecutors had argued originally, or that the plan was for Katie to know as little as possible, and that in the heat of the moment, Charles thought that the proper thing to do then was to tell Katie a lie. That Dan Markel had been in an accident, rather than the truth. That the thing she helped set in motion involved the murder of his ex-brother-in-law, Dan Markel. Of course, from Katie's proffer, we know that by this time, she already knew that what she had helped with was a murder. But what if the plan was for her not to know? What if Charles naively thought that he would tell Katie not to open and read the envelope, and that she would never do that? But instead, Katie did hand the envelope to Sigfredo, and both opened it together and read it together. Or what if Katie did as he requested at first, handing the envelope unopened to Sigfredo? But then, over time, Sigfredo did give Katherine hints about what the assignment was, so that over time, and before the murder was done, Katherine had enough information to find out what was up, so that by the time of July 18, 2014, Charles expected Katie not to know much, but in reality, Katie knew a lot. This latter scenario is the most consistent with Katie's proffer. Are there other scenarios consistent with the evidence? Sure. Here's another one. What if Charlie was also not as involved in the murder as we initially thought? What if, like Katie, he was just a conduit? What if the hit was the idea of another Adelson, and the other Adelson is the one who knew exactly what was supposed to happen to Dan Markel, not Charlie? What if Charlie thought at first that he was helping find someone who was only going to scare Dan Markel into submission, only to find out that what he had set in motion was a murder? What if Charlie did not know what was written in the letter inside that envelope that he supposedly put in Katherine's bag? What if, as Professor Lacasse testified that Wendy told him, Charlie had looked into hiring a hitman in 2013, only to realize it was too hard, and then maybe another Adelson decided to show him how it is done? This possible scenario is also consistent with the statement to Katherine that Dan Markel had been involved in an accident, a lie that may have been motivated by the desire to buy more time to process what happened, and to not freak out Katie, with him assuming that she did not know what she had helped set in motion, and with him trying not to freak her out. Nonetheless, this would be bizarre since by the next morning, he gives Katie a bag full of cash to deliver to the people to whom she had given the envelope with the instructions for the hit. More than likely, it was just another example of indirect talking, with him expecting Katie to understand what he meant, that whatever they had set in motion had been done. Again, these are all possible scenarios that may explain Charles Adelson's bizarre behavior and statements on the evening of the 18th. The state does not have to prove exactly what happened, just that the murder happened and who was involved. But that does not mean we should not try to get to the full truth. The one thing you can count on when you come to this channel for legal analysis is an objective analysis by an experienced lawyer. I do not have an agenda. I simply have the intellectual curiosity of analyzing the case fairly. We do that in every case we cover. So, if you want this 2024 reanalysis of the case involving the murder of Dan Markel to continue, you know what to do. Thanks for watching.
Mentor Lawyer and
Ladybug.